There we go. So now, welcome to today's session. My name is Josh Brothheim. I'm the training manager at Sumo Logic. And what we're going to be doing today is going through Kubernetes on Sumo Logic. So hopefully you're aware of today's topic. And we're going to kind of dive in here and start going. I have one of my peers, Odell Gordon. He's going to be manning the chat today. So if there's any questions or feedback or things you want to chat about, go ahead and post them in there. But let's go ahead and get started. So kind of away we go. There we go. So here's our agenda. We're going to be together for the next 3 hours. And if you've joined any of our other certification classes, they follow the same general schedule. So it's going to be 3 hours together, but 2 hours is going to be labs, content, slides. It's going to cover it. And then that last hour is set aside for the exam. So if you've taken an exam with us before, you kind of know where this is heading. If you haven't, we'll talk about that later. So, but the plan is to do a overview of Kubernetes. So for those of you that know Kubernetes, it might be a bit of a review. For those of you that are less familiar, I think it will be helpful for us to go over some of those basic concepts. And then we're going to jump into those labs. So we're going to start to, as it says, search with metadata, utilize some of the apps that we have in Sumo Logic, utilize the Explore tab and pre-built dashboards. Look at dashboards, both the old ones and the new ones, and we'll talk about the differences. And not old, classic is our name for them, but they are the older version. And then we'll do a monitoring troubleshooting lab. That lab will be a little funky, but we'll make our way through it, and then we'll get certified. So if that's kind of the game plan, we'll take a break in about an hour 15 or so, and yeah. As a reminder, once again, if you've attended one of our classes before, you probably are aware of this. What we're doing is a promotion to help you get certified and encourage you to get certified. So essentially, take today's class, which you've already done or started to do. You do need to attend the full session, and then take that certification exam at the end of class. Once you pass that, and you're going to pass that, you'll utilize one of our forms, and by filling out that form, what you'll get is a $15 Uber Eats voucher. So for each exam you pass, you get a $15 Uber Eats voucher. So we want to reward you with or bribery or whatever way you want to look at it. So strongly encourage you to take advantage of that, and I'll post that link up there later because it'll be more relevant after the exam, but that's something to help motivate you this morning. All right, so what are we going to do today? Well, there we go. Well, as I just described, but I have a couple slides that kind of just show imagery of what we're about to do. So the first thing, I guess no particular order, but essentially the first thing is we're going to look at the Kubernetes app and start to look at these dashboards that are showing up under the Explore tab, and just see how easy they are to use and how to take advantage of them. We're going to go ahead and create and customize our own dashboard. You might have created and customized your own dashboard in our fundamentals class. Different dashboards, same concept of dashboards, but different information on them. But it's going to be that same idea of taking a bunch of different pieces of information in different views, as you see here, some pie charts, some graphs, some just dynamic numbers in those nodes, and putting it all together into a view that you or somebody in your organization can appreciate. So we'll do that. We're going to go ahead and investigate and troubleshoot a crashed pod. This lab is a little bumpy, so we'll kind of do half of it, and then we'll kind of do the other half. You'll see what's going on there when we get to it, but it's a good example of how to use how to investigate and troubleshoot a crashed pod through Sumo. And then what else do we have? Finally, we have create the custom alert. So we'll go through those steps of, as it says here, creating a custom alert, which is really important, really valuable. As much as we are going to look at the inside of Sumo Logic and look at dashboards and look at a little bit well, not really queries too much, but a little bit of queries. The idea of creating alerts so that you can be notified when you are away from the system is really valuable. So you don't have to sit there looking at this dashboard all day. You get an email that says, hey, this thing has spiked, this thing has dropped, this thing is erroring, whatever it might be, and then you can go ahead and act on those. So that's quite valuable, and we'll cover that towards the end. All right, so what I'm going to do first is do a review of Kubernetes. So once again, if you know Kubernetes very well, this is going to be probably repetitive and you might be kind of junior for you. For those of you that are not as familiar though, I think this will be helpful. And so regardless, we're going to go through it. So. All right. So let's start back into the day, because traditionally monolithic app development is slow, and that's what we're showing on the left-hand side of the screen. In those environments, when one developer wants to make any update, it might be a tiny one, it might be a big one, regardless, the entire app has to be updated. And this slows changes down, or really slows everyone down and makes for less frequent and fewer changes. And so that's not ideal. Now, containerized apps scale and update faster. And the advantage of these is you can start to break up your big app into bite-sized chunks that are going to be called microservices. And that's being demonstrated on the right-hand side of the screen. In that case, or this case, each piece of the app, for example, you might have a portion of the app that authenticates users or serves photos or secures shopping cart data. Whatever it can be its own microservice. And so each microservice is independent. It can be written in a different language, and it can be updated without taking down the other components. And you can update your app now more frequently because you don't have to wait for other teams to push their updates as well. This has the benefit, or many benefits, but one of them is being more fault tolerant, since your app is going to be distributed across several databases. Now we're going to use an example of an app today, or not a website. We'll talk about apps specifically later. Our version of app and the way we're talking about an app right now are two different things. But let's talk about Travel Logic. So imagine we have this company that allows you to go on to their website and purchase hotel, holidays, airfare, rental cars, that type of thing. And that's kind of the scenario we're going to use for at least a little bit. We'll jump around with scenarios actually today. But so with this Travel Logic, what we've done is we've taken our single monolithic app on the left-hand side of the screen and broken it down into different microservices. So for example, with this app, we might have things like, as I mentioned earlier, the shopping cart, the vacation photo image repo might be a separate microservice. And so what we need to do is manage all these containerized services, or containerized microservices more specifically. And this is where Kubernetes starts to come in. So what is Kubernetes? Well, the major downside of these microservices is the architecture, structure, and knowledge overhead required to manage them. It can take a lot of work, essentially. And so Kubernetes is going to start to provide what is called a container orchestration system to manage all your microservices. It works with other containerization tools such as Docker, which is the most popular one. Kubernetes is open source and a certified member of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It scales up and down and works with your cloud-based architecture, including AWS, Google, and of course, Sumo Logic. These are kind of more of a fun fact for you, but the word Kubernetes itself comes from Greek for the word helmsman. And that's why the Kubernetes logo is a ship's wheel. So remember, just like a real ship's helmsman, Kubernetes guides your containers through the murky waters of the cloud. Now, another little fun fact is you may have seen the abbreviation for Kubernetes. It's K8S. And well, it says why, so I guess I can't really surprise you with it. But the reason it's K8S is because there's 8 letters in between the K and the S of Kubernetes. So it's just a shortcut. So a little fun fact. And I don't think that question is on the exam. All right, let's get into Kubernetes a little deeper and start to talk about clusters. Because your app is going to be broken into these microservices, and each of these microservices are going to run inside what's called a container. Now, the containers, so those are going to be inside a container. You're going to use Kubernetes to orchestrate these containers, and you're going to use nodes and pods and services and deployments. And these are all going to run on a cluster, which are going to be structured with a namespace. So that's what we're trying to demonstrate here, is at the higher level of the cluster. Within the cluster, you start to have your containers. and kind of get more granular. So on the screen, what do we see here? Let's kind of define these. So we have our cluster, which is going to be a group of machines or computers that are going to work together to distribute work. That's the definition we're going to use for today. You might have other definitions, but we think that's a pretty easy one. A node is, in utilizing that definition, is very simply one of those machines in the cluster. Now, a master node is going to be the machine that's going to manage the worker nodes and distributing tasks. It's essentially going to act as a primary, and sometimes is even referred to as the primary. Below the master node, we have a worker node, one of the machines that does the work of running the software, sometimes called secondary. And then we have, I'll keep going down here, inside the node, we have our pods. And this is the smallest object that Kubernetes can orchestrate. We have the container. That container is going to be a package of code, which is going to include dependencies, libraries, and the data. Let's see, there's more definitions on here, so I'll cover them. We'll use these again, but because on the bottom left of this diagram, or not the diagram, but the slide itself, services, deployments, namespaces, just want to define those as well. So the definition of service, at least as we're using it, is going to be something that handles requests and delivery. It's going to assign IP addresses, manage load balancing. Getting down to the deployment level is going to be a collection of pods that are managed by the same config file that runs the same routines. The deployments are going to define the desired state of the cluster. And then finally, we have the namespace, which is going to be a logical group or partition of a cluster. And we'll talk about all these later as well. So we'll go over this a little bit. All right. Now let's get into these lower levels, or not lower, but deeper. So as mentioned, that cluster, those group of machines that are going to work together to distribute the work. Distributed computing is more efficient. And since more machines are working on the same problem, that's going to increase efficiency, essentially. More machines distributing work and data is also going to provide a fault tolerance. So if one machine breaks or suffers a power outage, your app can still run. Now getting down to that node level that I mentioned earlier. So the node is going to be one of the machines in that cluster. That master node is the primary and going to be in charge of managing the worker nodes. And then the worker nodes are going to be the ones that actually do the work, that are going to run the software. And once again, those are sometimes called the secondary. Getting down to the pod level, smallest object that Kubernetes can orchestrate. And pods are ephemeral. And what we mean by ephemeral is they can be created and destroyed frequently as your clusters scale up or down to meet demand. So keep in mind, in the old days, the idea was to keep servers up essentially as long as possible. That was the goal. And I did some of that work as a network administrator. Servers needed to be up 24/7. No excuse, no if and but. The world is a little bit different. With pods, they get stood up and get stood down quite quickly as you need them. So it's no longer the goal to keep these things up running 24/7, although it is in one way of thinking about it. But these are going to scale up, scale down, possibly for seconds even, usually longer, usually minutes or minutes, hours, but it can be quite quick. And so Sumo, as we're going to see shortly, is going to help us keep track of these pods. All right, and now down to that container level. And so as a reminder, that container is going to be a package of code, and it's going to contain the dependencies, the libraries, and the data. So each container is going to run a microservice, like that shopping cart widget or the photo imagery for Travelogic. And then the containers are going to be created using that container application like Docker. We're not going to go down to that level with Docker, but that's kind of where we're going to be, where we're going to stop for definitions at least. All right. Let's keep going. All right. So Sumo Logic is automatically going to enrich your Kubernetes metadata on ingest. So let's start to talk about how that works and what that means. So what is metadata? So your data is the information you store about the app. or about your app rather, more specifically. At Travelogic, this could include information like flight schedules, users' credit card information, a wide variety of different data. Metadata is the data about data. It might be the file size. It might be the IP address source of the data. It might be other information like that. And metadata is often contained in log files. Now, when using Sumo Logic, a lot of what we work with is metadata. And you can search by fields and source categories and key value pairs and many other data types. And if you've taken the fundamentals class or any of our classes, really, you've utilized metadata probably most simply in source category. If you design metadata well, when you set up your collectors, you're going to save a lot of time and money managing your data later. By having good metadata, it's going to allow, once again, the searching of filters to start to be able to work and to allow you to find what you need quicker. Very simple. Now, using metadata, and we're going to go ahead and do this as an example shortly, we're going to work with several types of metadata in this class, including the source categories that I mentioned. Actually, I mentioned both of these, the source categories and the collector field key value pair. For example, showing on the top left of this screen, we have our cube source category. Specifically, our cube source category metadata tag. So this is the metadata tag for the source category that's applied to our data. What we're doing here is using the regex, but it's really just wildcards. It's really called a fancy regex. But essentially, we're going to use a query to look for everything related to Kubernetes in our environment. Now, we could also use an option of a node metadata tag. And this is going to be useful if we want to look for a particular node that's experiencing an error. And if we need to find more information about it to troubleshoot it later. Now, we'll talk about that kind of example later as well. Now, when you or your admin set up the collector fields, you want to ensure that all the Kubernetes data is going to be tagged properly. So it's important that you navigate to the Kubernetes cluster later properly. The screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen is starting to show what the metadata tag editor looks like in the Sumo Logic UI. And we're going to work with that a little bit later as well in the course. All right, a couple more slides and then we'll get into the lab environment. So the last slide, or next to the last slide before that, is once again about the data pipeline. So as mentioned, using the Travelogic app, this app is collecting a lot of data, collecting metadata for our customers and what activities they're running on our site. And the app is containerized and runs inside Kubernetes, so all our data lives inside the Kubernetes cluster. Now, when working with Kubernetes, we're going to have another set of data and metadata to work with. Your source for all this data is actually going to be Kubernetes itself, which is going to generate logs, events, metrics, and security information. Each of these types of data from your app and from Kubernetes itself must be brought into Sumo Logic through various collectors. And so what we're starting to see here, for example, let's start on the bottom. On the bottom, for example, we have our security data, and that's going to be collected or brought in using a program, we can call it, called Falco. For our logs, for example, on the top of the screen, Fluent Bit is going to be utilized to bring in those logs. And then Prometheus will be used for metrics. And then which one did I leave out? Fluent D. Fluent D will be used for events. And we'll look at these a little bit later. But so we're going to have each source of data is going to have its own collector, essentially, or collection method. So what we're seeing here is the Kubernetes source on the left is generating the data. It's collected by the collectors in the center of the screen, those Fluent Bit, Fluent Ds. And then this data is going to be brought into a centralized Fluent D pipeline, this light gray box over here. And this is where the metadata is enriched. So when it hits this step, this enrichment step, that's where it's going to apply the service. It's using the pod name, the namespace name, all those names, all that information is going to be applied at that point. And then from there, you can then search the data in Sumo Logic on the right-hand side of the screen. So that's a pretty good representation of data pipeline. All right, one more slide. Around metadata enrichment, and more specifically with Prometheus. So your Prometheus collector is going to provide the Kubernetes metrics, and it also has an auto discover capability that's going to find the current state of your Kubernetes hierarchy. So during the collection process, metadata about pods, nodes, and other features are automatically going to be tagged and organized. However, the auto discovery feature doesn't provide information about services or deployments. Once again, it does for pods and nodes and those things, but not services and deployments. The metadata enrichment step tags these as key value pairs, and this is going to ensure your metadata is consistent across your clusters. As a Kubernetes user, you might have already a mental model of your cluster, and you might have naming conventions associated with your architecture. Sumo Logic lets you use this existing mental model with a custom key value pair metadata tagging. All this metadata is going to help you better understand your Kubernetes cluster. By utilizing all this metadata, you'll be able to know where every piece of data came from, like which pod it was running on, or which namespace label it was grouped by. And we're going to go ahead, and I think I mentioned this earlier, we're going to set up some custom key value pairs and search for metadata tags in these next few labs. So what we're going to do now is start to go into these labs. So let's go ahead and direct you. So what I'm going to do, two things. The first is we're going to go ahead and log into the system. So let me go ahead and put these credentials in the chat. If you've used our training environments before, you probably kind of know where we're headed with these, or the kind of the gist of this. So we're going to go ahead and log into Sumo Logic. We're going to go to service.sumologic.com. We're going to use the email of training plus analyst number at sumologic.com, and you're going to select a 3-digit number. So maybe you want to be training plus analyst 007, training plus analyst 391784. Pick a 3-digit number. And then the password we're going to use is spring with a capital S, 22 exclamation point. So go ahead and log in. I'll give you all a moment or two to do so. Once you've logged in, if you go ahead and put the number you're using, if there's overlap, or it doesn't really matter, we're a pretty small group. If you need help, of course, holler, but you've probably done this before. All right, looks like cool. People are starting to get in, so let me go ahead and log in. And actually, while I log in, let me go ahead and add the lab guide to the chat here. And I think this is the right one. So what I'm putting into the chat is a PDF that will contain our labs. So I have my PDF. I'm now going to go ahead and log into Sumo Logic. And password. There was a question, let me go back to it. So continue to get logged in, please. But the question was kind of over here, where do these collectors run? So they would run in your environment. I'm using kind of air quotes for yours, but it's going to be prior to Sumo Logic. So probably like, it could be any environment really, but AWS-ish, Google Cloud, depends where you, or how or where you're utilizing these things. But these would be actual components you would need to install. They're very easy to install, and we have directions, but they would be something that you would install. So, all right. So it looks like everybody, not everybody, but I think everybody's logged in. Once you're logged in, you should be on a page that looks pretty similar to this. I'm going to clean up this page a little bit. I'm going to close all this stuff. This stuff is just because I or somebody else logged in with this account, and I don't really need their stuff right now. So ideally, you're on this screen, which is the home page. So once again, you're on the home page, you have the lab guide, and let's go. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and use the lab guide. What we're going to do is, yeah, I'll just go straight into the lab guide. So let's jump into the lab guide. And let's start with, well, lab 0 we can actually skip, or we actually completed rather, excuse me. Let's get credit for it. So lab 0 is logging into the training environment. So hopefully, and I think we're all logged in, so cool. What we're going to do in lab 1 is identify source categories. And I guess saying identify source, well, I guess that's an okay way to describe it. We're essentially going to look for a specific source category that's already been defined. And we're going to do the same way that that screenshot showed earlier. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and I'm going to keep my lab guide on the side of my screen. I'll bring it over every now and then, but what we want to do here, come on, there we go, is go ahead and now start to utilize the log query searching capabilities first. So if I feel like everybody should know how to do a log search, but if you're on the home page, you can either go to log search or you can go to plus new log search. Now what we can do is now we can do a log search or a query. The query we're going to use is the one that is in the lab guide. So let me go ahead and copy it. Let me go ahead. The lab guide should be in the chat. Let me go ahead and put it back in. Okay, so it should be in there. Hopefully everybody got it. Oh, a couple of people saying, where's the lab guide? Does somebody have the lab guide? Okay, so a few of you do. For those of you that don't have the lab guide, let me show you how to get, yeah, let me show you how to get it real fast. This is good for everybody because there was also a question of how to get access to the slides. So we'll kind of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. And so I'm not putting in the chat a URL, I'm actually putting a PDF, but let me show you how to get it for those of you that can't. What I'm going to do, or what you're going to do, is go to, oh wait, this isn't going to work. Let me see. We're going to go to get certified. So we're going to go to get certified. And what we're going to go to is, I think it's, oh, it's here. Sorry, it's been a little while since I've been in here. So let me just show these steps a little bit slower. So we went to the home tab, we went to certification, we went to get certified. When we get to get certified, we should be on this page. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on recorded live training. What this has is exactly what it sounds like, recorded live training. Now I don't know. We don't have it in here. Okay, so I apologize. We don't have the Kubernetes guide in here. What we're going to do is if you do not have the guide or can't access the guide, go ahead and message Odell in the chat and he'll just shoot you an email with the guide. So apologize about that. I forgot we didn't have it uploaded yet in here. So we'll use that. So I'm going to go ahead and continue since we're not really doing anything that crazy anyhow. So so if you have the guide, great, let's follow along. If you don't, message Odell, he'll email to you, and yeah, away we go. So we're going back into our search, and we're going to go ahead and grab the search query that's in the lab guide, which is the source category equals cube with that underscore. So what we're essentially saying is, I mentioned this is regex, barely regex, it's just wildcards. But basically we're saying, look for a source category, a metadata tag that has the word, or not even the word, the 4 letters cube in it. I don't even bother looking for the whole word Kubernetes, let's just look for those 4 letters. When I click search, I should have data, finger crossed, and I do. So what we see is in this search is now showing everything related to Kube or Kubernetes. And what we can do, and we won't do too much deeper, but as you know, certainly from fundamentals, and if you've taken search mastery, now you can start to get deeper with the query, and now you can say where, where or if, or do whatever you want really from there. Now, let's go ahead and show another way to do this. The log search method is helpful. It's getting kind of hand sturdy, I guess you could say, in a good way. But there's another way to do a very similar feature. What we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and use the black bar on the side of the screen. If the black bar is hidden, click on the hamburger icon, black bar. And what I want you to do is go to Manage Data and go to Collection. And what we're seeing in here are all the collectors that are bringing the data into Sumo Logic. Now, this is not going to include the collectors that somebody had asked the question about. This would not include the Fluent D collector. This would not include those collectors. This would be after that information has passed through those, it arrives into Sumo Logic. And so we see all kinds of stuff in here. I'll go ahead and expand none. And so what I see here is there's lots of different types of data. In our lab data, we have AWS data and Box, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, once again, we're only really interested in Kubernetes data for today. So what I can do here, kind of like I did earlier, is search just for kube. And so what it's pulling is now anything that has the word or the string kube in it. What we want you to look for, and it should be on page 2, is, and actually it should be the last one, is this prod01.travellogic.info. And so we're going to use this as our example, but actually we've already started to use it as our example. So imagine we have our Travellogic company, we have our app, here is our data for that company, and we'll start to drill into it shortly and play around with it. What we're seeing from here, though, is possibly interesting. It's showing me just straight graphical information. So over the past hour, we've had 22,000 messages. This is related for my whole Travellogic info. And then I could see in here, once again, start to get more specific. So if I want to just look at the kubelet metrics, kube state metrics, whatever it might be, I can. And we're going to go ahead and start to look at these shortly, but not through this view, through the Explorer view, which is going to be much more visual. Let's see, what else in here? That's kind of it. So that's lab 1. Let's go ahead and now do lab 2. What we're going to do in lab 2 is we're going to go ahead and use the Kubernetes metadata, but this time we're going to use the key value pair metadata. In the first example, we were using the source category. So what we can do is, once again, do a new log search. And what we can do is then type or paste, I'll probably paste just because I'm a little bit lazier, that enter namespace equals Sumo Logic. And so when we run this, as it says in the lab, this query is going to filter those log messages and only show those messages that have a namespace of Sumo Logic. What we can do to verify that is we can go down to our namespace and we see Sumo Logic. So it's now showing us only those messages that have or are associated with that Kubernetes key value pair. And so as it says, great, now you know how to run a query, how to query a namespace, excuse me, in a Kubernetes cluster. All right, let me go back to my slides. I think there's, a couple slides here. Actually a whole bunch of slides. So I'm gonna go through these slides. I won't be surprised if you poke around and play around in the labs or the environment while I'm going through these slides. Feel free to poke around, but let me go through these. So there we go. So what we're going to talk about now is Sumo Logic apps for Kubernetes. And it's going to be important that we define what we're talking about specifically in the word apps. The apps we're going to talk about now are not the apps I was referring to earlier. So earlier when I was talking about the Travellogic app, I was talking about an app, not to use the word as the definition, but an app that might be on your phone that you would use to search airfare and hotels and rental cars and all that. And you might be able to go to the computer and use that app. So that's the app I was talking about earlier. What I'm going to be talking about now is an app in what Sumo Logic calls an app. And what we refer to as an app, and you'll see it shortly, I'll get into it in more detail, is essentially an overlay of queries and dashboards that we think are helpful for a data source. So when I'm referring to a Sumo Logic app for Kubernetes, what I'm talking about is the Kubernetes data being ingested, and we at Sumo Logic providing you helpful views of that data. And we're going to talk about that in more detail, but that's essentially where I'm driving at. Once again, if you took even the fundamentals class, like we go over an app in that class. So hopefully you either remember or are familiar with that kind of terminology. So let's go ahead and dig into that a little bit. So in regards to apps, there's a few different apps that we're talking about. There's the apps that the company runs, such as Travelogic up here. There we go. We have there we go. Sorry, I just wanted to get it fully loaded. So once again, we have the Travelogic app on the top left of the screen, which is the app that the customers use to actually book their vacation. We have the Kubernetes cluster on the top right, where the Travelogic app is broken down into those microservices. And that's the Kubernetes cluster that the company manages, or your company manages. And now there's the Sumo Logic Kubernetes app, which is once again going to let you gain insight from all the data that's been generated by your Kubernetes cluster and the Travelogic app in one view. So the primary app we're going to be working with is the Sumo Logic's Kubernetes app. This app has many features and benefits, and so let's talk about a few of them. The first is the ability to manage and monitor multiple clusters. Centralized metadata enrichment that ensures consistent tagging across those logs and metrics, events, and security data is going to be important and a big benefit. Getting that visibility into the worker nodes, the namespaces, the deployments, being able to really dig in there so that you can explore those clusters and containers and pods and nodes. The views that are going to center around the namespace, the deployments, the services within your cluster to help provide deeper visibility and possibly a different perspective from traditional hardware-centric views. A few more benefits. The live and dynamic pre-built dashboards that I was trying to allude to a few moments ago that are going to allow you to take advantage of all those logs, metrics, and events data. All this is built to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation standards and comes with out-of-the-box security features. And so during these next few lab activities, we're going to start to install this app and play around with some of the pre-built dashboards. Excuse me. Now, there are other apps that are associated with Kubernetes, and these are called control plane apps. And they have a few features in common. All these apps are going to run alongside the Kubernetes app. And so what you can do is you can use both a control plane app and a control plane app and the regular Kubernetes app to maximize your visibility into your cluster. So while the Kubernetes app is going to monitor the worker nodes, the control plane is going to provide visibility into the master node, the API server, the kube system. It's going to give you just more information. And there's going to be different control plane apps for the type of managed service you're using, whether it's just open source Kubernetes, or if you're using one that's managed by Google, Amazon, or Azure. Now, talking about apps, just going to continue on this theme. Let's talk a little bit more because it's worth it. A couple more slides about apps. So we have several CI and CD apps that help your DevOps experts work with Kubernetes on Sumo Logic. And this can ensure performance and then help manage your Kubernetes infrastructure. And then finally, security apps. We have several security partners, and SecOps apps are available for both security and SecOps. And so these apps are going to provide deeper analysis and detection tools for securing your data. Now, just to kind of finish up the app dialogue, there's hundreds of apps. Of course, we're really focusing on Kubernetes, but there's over 200, and really not related to Kubernetes, but just a best practice, or something I'd strongly encourage you to do is anytime you load a new source of data into Sumo Logic or new to you, I'd encourage you to utilize the app for that source of data because it's going to provide to you, as you'll see if you haven't seen before, just an instant overlay of these dashboards and queries that will give you insight. You're not going to be looking at your straight log messages, which may not tell you anything. Automatically, you're going to get graphs and charts and numbers, and it's going to be more illustrative. So we'll see that again. Strongly encourage you to use them. So yeah. Let's see. I'm just thinking if we should go to the lab guide now. Yeah, let's go back to the lab guide. So what we're going to do is go back to the lab guide and back into Sumo. So for lab 3, what we're going to do is we're going to install the Sumo Logic app. So the idea is we now have identified Kubernetes data. And let's see, we should still be able to install. Yeah, let's go ahead and install it. So yeah, it's kind of fill in the blank or just follow the steps. So on the left-hand side of the screen, black bar, we're going to go to the app catalog. And now what we're going to do is look for the app that we want to utilize. Now, it's probably on the very top under popular apps. It's going to be just called Kubernetes. If you want to search for it, you can type Kubernetes. You can scroll through all the apps. But if it's on the top, that's probably easier just to click on it. So once you've found it, what you're going to do is click install. And now what we're going to do is essentially fill in the blanks. And what the blanks that we're filling in is essentially telling the system where our data is. So we have Kubernetes data in here. We have these queries and dashboards that are going to be applied via the app, but we need to tie the two together. And so we need to tell the app, hey, look over here for this type of data. And we can kind of be generic, not generic, but we can be vague. Vague's not the right word either. We can utilize the wildcards, which is what we're about to do. So for example, we could specify a source category and get very specific, or we can, as we see in this lab, we're just going to say, look for Falco. Now, why are we using the term Falco? If you remember, and I don't really expect that you do, Falco is going to be used to bring in our security logs. And so that's why we're going to say, look for Falco. Now for the event log source of data, we're just going to look for star event star. You may want to add to the app name just a number or your initials. If somebody has already logged into the system, into this account and created a Kubernetes app, you can't create one. So I'm just going to put my initials just to make sure I don't butt up against that. It shouldn't be a problem for you. Be a problem for our afternoon class, but and then what I'm going to do is click add to library. Now, once I do, essentially, Sumo Logic is taking, or not taking, referencing that Falco and event data, referencing these queries and dashboards that somebody at Sumo has created, and for lack of a technical phrase, smushing the two together. And so what we get takes actually, this is taking longer than normal. There we go. Is what we get is now our information. So let's start to look and poke around to see what's in here. So we have under our personal folder, we have our Kubernetes. We have all these dashboards. And now we can start to open these. So let's go ahead and start with, I don't know, let's start with cluster overview. Seems like a good place to start. I'm going to click on cluster overview here or over here. It doesn't really matter which one. And fingers crossed, we have data. And so now I am getting insight into my environment. I have 99 nodes ready. That's good. I have 16 unscheduled pods. Usually red is bad. And somebody smarter than me might know what to do with this information. I'm kind of joking, of course. But now we're getting this insight. Let's go ahead and check on, I don't know, feel free to just click around. Let's do, I don't know, let's do security overview. Security is kind of important. What we see here is the security overview utilizing Falco. And our dashboard even has, of course, has data in it. It also can just have straight text, which here we're just providing you some documentation or instructions. But what we see here, there have been 22 critical alerts over the past 30 minutes. But fortunately, no emergency alerts. What rules have been triggered over the last 30 minutes? If nobody should be creating pods, then this is quite concerning. If and so that you can start to take advantage of that. And so I didn't, as you saw, I got the data ingested. We don't really do ingestion in this class, but once the data is in Sumo, I now have this great overlay. All right. And so let me see. Let me go back to the slides. So I'm going to go through my slides here. This is just kind of describing a lot of these dashboards. And so while I'm going through these, feel free to click around in them. So there's a lot in here, but feel free to just poke around because that's really what we want to show. So those pre-configured dashboards for Kubernetes, those all should be available to you. And I think there might even be another extra one or two now. But as you saw, I jumped in the cluster overview, the security overview. And so, feel free to poke around the other ones. With the Cluster Explorer dashboard, what we were seeing here is, as it says, an overview of memory and CPU per node and pod. And so what we're using here are these honeycombs to represent the node or the pod. And then, as it says, color dynamically is going to display information essentially. So and we can poke around these as you mouse over them, you're going to get different values. So let's go ahead and just jump in this. If you're not, or I'll jump in it. So I'm going to go into what was it, cluster overview. And so what we want to show you with the honeycombs, here are the pods, and here are the values. And what I can see here is the color gradient is darker means more, essentially. And so that's helpful from just straight from that view. All right, let's jump into the nodes dashboard. And actually, let me just show them from here, and I'll talk about them. I don't think I need to use the slides at the same time. But let's jump into the nodes dashboard. So Kubernetes, node, or node overview, either way. The node dashboard is going to provide health and performance metrics about all the nodes in our cluster. So here we're starting to see utilizations. We're going to also see down below here, we start to see averages and trend lines. And we can use these averages and long-term trends to start to look for spikes and dips. So for example, even without knowing what this is, I see this line was higher and now it's going lower, and that probably means something to me. If it was spiking, that also might mean something to me. Here we have just a spike here. This is something we might want to dig into, and so we're starting to get that visual information. Now, something I don't think I mentioned yet. Let's see if I can show it. I can show it on any of these. The node overview is a fine place to do it. We have the ability to filter by cluster. Right now, when I'm looking at my Kubernetes data, remember I looked for Falco and I looked for events. And I looked for both of those and basically said, bring in all the events and all the Falco or all the security event data. What I didn't specify, though, is what environment or what app or what cluster, specifically the cluster, I wanted to utilize. In our training environment, we don't just have the Travelogic data, which is represented here. We have some coffee bar training, which is for another, just different class. We have SE demo, which is for our SEs to do demos. And so we can go ahead and specify, and we probably should for today's demonstration, although we're not really going too deep into this right now. We could specify just show me Travelogic info. And now I'm saying, don't show me all the Kubernetes data in the system. Show me all the Kubernetes data system for my Travelogic app or company. Now, one of the reasons we have it showing everything is some of this just doesn't have data. So by leaving it wide open, we just get a greater set of data. And also we could go down to the node level. So when we're at the node level or at the node overview, we can go to the cluster or the node level. Let's see, I showed the security overview already. What other ones should I show? I guess that's about it. As far as these go, I mean, they're all useful. All right, now what I want to do is, let's see, should I go back to the lab guide? Sorry, just looking through this. Let's go to lab 5 next. So what we did in lab 4, let me just see here. Yeah, so lab 4 reviewed the pre-configured dashboards. And we'll go into, yeah, let's do lab 5 now. Let's go into there, and then we'll probably take a break. I think we're going to be a little ahead of schedule today as well, which usually nobody complains about. So in lab 5, what we want to do is we want to introduce another way to navigate through the system. What we want to introduce here is the Explore tab or button. The way to get it is to go to the plus new and then select Explore. Now, when you're selecting Explore, what you're choosing are different views, as you're seeing right away, of our data. Now, by default, you might be in a different view. You have the ability to change this. What I do want you to do is select the Kubernetes node view, because that's the one we're going to use. But as you'll see, you can use any of these. AWS observability is meant for AWS, so that's not today's topic. If you were using RUM, real user monitoring, that would be relevant here. So, but we're using the Kubernetes ones. Now, you might notice when you get into the Kubernetes node view, there is no data. The reason there's no data is, or possibly depending on how you're looking at it, is for this cluster, we're looking at this app components. I don't even know what this app components cluster is. I didn't create it. I don't know anything about the data in there, so I'm going to ignore it because I want us to go to our travel logic info because that data I do know. So go ahead and click on Prod 01 travel logic info. And there should, yeah, there we go. There's data. And so now what we're starting to see is the data related to the nodes, related to the, well, cluster, the node view, but we're in the cluster overview. We have the ability to modify the pod that we're looking at, or even the node. We can get really down to at any level we want. So what we see here on the left-hand side of the screen is our travel logic info, and we see the nodes that have produced data over the last 15 minutes. If we want to, we can get more granular and actually get down to the pod level. And so what we're seeing here at the pod level is this node is running AWS, Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, Falco, Kubernetes, MongoDB, all these different pieces of the puzzle essentially that are utilized for our main app. So this is how we can now go in and say the travel logic app is up and running fine, but I can now go ahead and start to edit just my CrowdStrike stuff. Now, not edit it through Sumo Logic. This is just a visual of what has been edited or what has occurred, but that's how I can start to use these pods at the microservice level. But what we're seeing in Sumo Logic is an illustration of that. So if I go down to the CrowdStrike pod, I'm now looking at just CrowdStrike information for this specific node. And there might be things in here that are concerning. I see the log messages. We're going to get into that in a moment, but I just, like I said, visually start to see these things. And then, as mentioned, we can get even more granular. So if we're going down to the pod level, the pod contains that container. And so we can get down to that level. Once again, just going as deep as we need to. All right. Let's see. On the right side, I want us to go to the containers. So what I did right here is go down to the CrowdStrike level, or any of them. It doesn't really matter which one. And I wanted to select the dashboard. And you might have more dashboards. These are dependent on the app you created and if other people have created apps in your account. And then we have a couple in here just by default that Kenneth, one of our engineers, created a long time ago. Now we're looking at that level. So we're really getting quite granular. All right, let's see what else in here. Let me go back to my slides. So I'll do a few more slides and then we'll take our break. We're doing pretty good. So let me, let's see which slides. Oh, I wanted to talk about the different views. No. So the Explore tab. So what we did earlier is we went to the Explore tab and we went to, we went to the new tab and we went to selected Explore. Now, when I selected Explore, as you saw, really represented more by the next slide, there were those different Explore by views, specifically 4 of them that we were going to utilize. And so what I wanted to do is just talk about the differences between them. And so I'm going to talk about the differences, but at a high level, the node view is going to be utilized to show the cluster hierarchy. That deployment is going to be used to monitor performance. The service view is going to be used to look at the pods nodes by each service. And then the namespace view is to track across namespace, hence the names. Going to get a little more granular with those, or more descriptive, I guess, is a better way to say it. So for example, with that node view, you can visualize your cluster hierarchy with it, and it's going to let you drill down into the clusters. You're going to be able to see all your clusters in the node view, and you can drill down into the nodes inside those clusters, the pods inside those nodes, and the containers inside those pods. You can also explore the infrastructure topology on your cluster so that no matter where it's stored, it's going to show up in Sumo Logic. So that's where the node view is helpful. Now, why might you use the deployment view? This is going to be helpful if you want to organize your cluster into deployments inside your namespaces or view that organization of those clusters. It's going to display the pod and container used by each deployment. And it's going to allow you to view these to monitor deployment performance and manage necessary changes. Service view. With the service view, it's going to organize the services inside your namespaces and display the pods and containers used by each service. This view is going to group all your service pods into one view, making it easier to monitor those ephemeral pods. You can also, or one of the other benefits is the ability to monitor and improve your end user's experience with this view by keeping tabs on your services. And by keeping tabs, just keeping an eye on them. All right, and then finally, the namespace view. This is going to, there we go. This is going to allow you to organize, or allow us to organize the pods and containers in each namespace. And so you can use those namespaces to break up large clusters into different teams, different products. You can restrict access to each namespace. And so that's where those are used. All right. Oh, once again, so let's go ahead and take our break. So let's do a 10-minute break. So I'm going to do a 10-minute timer. And so, yeah, go ahead, step away, grab a snack, grab a beverage, do what you got to do. And then we'll come back. We'll do a few more labs, answer any questions, of course, and then take the exam. So see you all in a few minutes. If there's questions in the excuse me. If there's questions in the meantime, go ahead and post them in the chat. I and Odell will probably be stepping away, but when we come back, we'll go ahead and certainly answer them. So see you all in a few moments and have a good break. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had a good little break, maybe a little snack or whatever. Let's go ahead and pick back up. So can jump into dashboards now. So once again, just a few slides here, and then we'll play around with these. So previously, in the old days, not that long ago, Sumo Logic used to have only one dashboard available. And when we say one dashboard type, you could create many different dashboards, but we'll talk about the new and the old. And that dashboard system is still available, and we call it Dashboard Classic. What Dashboard New adds is some of those features that you start to see in the Explore tab, specifically the honeycomb panels, among other things, of course. But that's one of the advantages of using the new dashboards. We're going to look at some of the other advantages, such as utilizing things like JSON, which is going to be really helpful for you to customize your dashboard, but we'll get into that. And let's see. So yeah, so the classic dashboard was more basic. As it says, fewer colors, fewer font choices, which is very important to you guys. A lot of customers wanted, more options with that, and so we did that. And like I said, you'll see that within the JSON. And then there's more advanced filtering, which is more beneficial. The panels can be built directly into the dashboard, which is kind of cool. The old way of doing it, you would create the query, and then you would essentially save it to a dashboard. And what you can do now is actually get into that dashboard and build it from within the dashboard itself, which is, yeah, it's a better way of doing it. All right, so as far as different panel types and things like that, you saw some of these as well while poking around. And so, for example, the most basic panel types are going to be the single values and really just text boxes. The single value, as we see on the top right here, is going to display a metric, usually a count of data, a number of errors, a number of active nodes, as we see here, some other single number, not single digit, but single number. Text boxes are very straightforward. They can be used to display anything you'd like. So many people use them to attribute sources to their data or give short explanations of how to use or interpret the dashboard. So it's just a good way to put notes, essentially. Now, we can get more advanced with categorical charts, hard to say, which is going to allow the basically to graph data across categories. And so you can start to use these different chart types to look at comparisons of percentages of errors between good versus bad, utilizing pie charts versus a bar chart versus a column chart. And these are all things, or many things, that we covered, although not specifically the new dashboards features, but in the fundamentals class of, here's the data in a bar chart, here's it in a column chart. Same data, just different ways to look at it. And some people might have personal preferences of what they prefer, or organizational preferences even. Now, another type of chart is going to be time series. So the time series charts are going to allow you to show a panel of graph of data over time. So then what's going to happen here is that your query in a time series chart is going to need to be time sliced if it's derived from logs. Where the time slice is going to be important is it's going to allow you to take your data and look at it granularly, like it says, per minute. So what you can do is you can look at the last 24 hours of data and look at it in 1 minute time slices and say, show me data from 10 o'clock to 10:01, from 10:01 to 10:02, to 10:01 to 10:02 to 10:03, etc. Or you might want to do 5 minute time slices, data from 10 o'clock to 10:05, from 10:05 to 10:10, and so on and so forth. So just different approaches. And yeah, this was also covered in fundamentals, I think. Let's see, the honeycombs. And finally, these are really the most dynamic chart types, I guess we call them. So if your logs or your metrics have geolocation data, you can create a map chart. And remember, for that geolocation data, all you need is either an IP address, or if you actually have regional data, you can just use that straight away if you know your countries or what have you. You can also, if you have data that wants to or needs to be compared to a relative average, that's where these honeycomb charts on the bottom right that you're showing here are going to be helpful. So what it's showing is, like really just said, a relative average, and then those abnormalities or those outliers essentially. So here we see, everything seems to be good with those CPU limits by pod, but there's one that's different. And that's the one we probably want to investigate. These charts are going to display these hotspots as I'm kind of referring to that as. And so you can very simply see which chart through the chart, which pod or which container is using more resources than the other pods. If we were talking about the maps, we can see where larger populations exist versus smaller ones. And that's what the yellow and the green are starting to differentiate on the top portion there. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and do the lab where we're going to create a dashboard. So in this case, we're going to use lab 6. And so what we're going to do, as kind of says here, we're going to create a 4-panel dashboard. So we're going to create a dashboard using those 4 features, I guess you could say, that I mentioned earlier. So the text panel, the single value, the time series, and then that categorical chart. That is not easy to say. And then, as it says, we can customize our dashboard using colors, which, like I said before, is very important to some people out there. And then once again, we can save and share our dashboard. So let's go ahead and do so. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go exit out of the slides. I'm going to jump back into Sumo. You should still be in Sumo. It shouldn't have timed out on you. If it did, just re-log in. I'll post those credentials again in the chat, but everyone should still be in it. Oop, the wrong thing to paste. There we go. So there are those credentials in the chat once again. So what I want to do here is I want to go into Sumo. I'm actually just going to close all this other stuff. I don't really need it. And I'm going to grab my lab guide right here. And just start going through it. So as it says, lab 6, create and share a new dashboard. We want to log in, which we should all be in. And now we're going to go to plus new and go to dashboard. So we're going to go plus new. And then at the very bottom, or almost very bottom, is that dashboard new option. Notice there's not a dashboard classic because those need to be created differently. Yeah. All right. So once we're in our dashboard, now we can start to create it and adjust it. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do step 1, which is going to be the single value panel. Sorry, just trying to get all this in. So for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to select the panel that we want to get started with, and we're going to use the single value option. When we mouse over, as it says, we're going to use a single number, single metric. So we have our query builder at the top, and now we're going to start to build our query. What we can do here and what we have to do here is select the source of data. So do we want to utilize logs or do we want to utilize metrics? You can choose many options, but for this example, we want to use metrics. And the metric we want to display, I should have read that, is we want to create a panel that's going to display how many nodes are active in our Kubernetes cluster. So in order to see how many nodes are active, we want to use our metrics. Now from here, what we're going to do is, as it says, select under the metric, the cube pod information. So we can go ahead and search for it, which is probably easier. Actually, it's probably easier to paste what's in the lab guide. There we go. So I'm looking for, let's see, it should show up with, as it says, with the cube. There it is. So I want to grab this guy. Now under the filters, I want to select the origin. And by selecting the origin, now I can select specifically Kubernetes. And so I'm basically starting to say, only show me Kubernetes information. Now I do want to filter this even further. Remember, I mentioned earlier in this training environment, we have Kubernetes data for Travel Logic, which is the example we're using, but we also have data for the SE demo. We also have that coffee bar data. So in this case, I want to specify, I just want to look at production Travel Logic data. So what I can do here is I can now specify the collector is going to be prod01.travellogic.info. And that was that collector that we showed or looked at, well, it seems like hours ago, but earlier this morning. All right, so I have my filters, I have my metric, most important, well, they're all important, but I have my metric. I have my filter saying just look for Kubernetes and just look specifically in my Travel Logic stuff. And now when we select the chart, let's see, it should pre-populate. If it isn't, go ahead and search and then go back to chart and you should start to get information. So hopefully you're starting to see some data. It should be the same number as me. If it's a different number, it doesn't really matter, that's fine, but it should be the same. And what we can do here is now we can start to customize this. So what we're going to do in the data portion here on the far right is go ahead and select the type of, really under statistics type, we want to do a count. So now we're counting all those nodes. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to just rename this label. It's called label by default. I don't really know why that's, well, I guess just it's the name, it's a label, but we can go ahead and call this nodes. We could call this nodes, we can call it whatever we want. We can also mess around, and I say mess around, it's important, but the font size. I guess decimals doesn't really do anything, but we can start to play around with those. Now, another customization we can use here is the threshold. This threshold allows us to utilize the colors to represent different values. So we could say, as it says here, we could say 0 to 10 is going to be red, 11 to 25 is going to be yellow, and 26 to 99 is going to be green. And now when we look at this, if we see this as green, this might mean something to us. If this is red, this might mean something bad to us. These could be good values, they could be bad value, up to you to decide, but it's now starting to show us essentially using colors to indicate the value or the importance. Well, using the colors however you want. And you can customize the colors. So red, yellow, green is most traditional, I guess, but certainly, if you want to make that color mean something to you, or you want to make it green for money, you can go ahead and modify that. And these are features that you couldn't do in the classic dashboard as easily. So while it may seem silly to point these things out there, once again, like I said earlier, some customers have requested them, and there's value in them. All right, one other thing I'm going to show here, just because, or actually I'm going to save it for later. Too late, I clicked on it. What I wanted to show here is the ability for you to utilize JSON to create this query or modify the, not even create this query, modify this dashboard panel. So what I just did here in this display view is I said, once again, I put it in green, I put the font size, I messed around with it. But what I can do is I can actually go to the JSON and modify it from here. And this gives me more control. I might have JSON previously defined that I want to just copy in here to define the colors. And I can do that all from within here. And once again, this is a feature that was requested and gives an important feature, a very valuable feature that was requested and gives you now more control over your charts. Just more power. All right, so let's see, I think I'm done with this. And now what do I need to do? I'm sorry, I forgot to include the last step, and probably the most important is add to dashboard. So what I want to do is now take this panel I created, click add to dashboard, and now I have a dashboard with one panel. Now we're going to add a second panel and then a third and the fourth. So kind of see where we're going with it. So let's do step 2, which is that categorical panel. And this is really going to be helpful for letting us know, as it says, what kind of error messages is our cluster receiving. So to do this, we're going to go to Add Panel again. And now we're going to select the panel we want to add. Categorical. And now we're going to create the query. So we want to go ahead and once again utilize our metrics. And since we want to look at error messages, well, yeah, you might not notice. So we want to look specifically at fluentd error messages. So in our metrics, we want to look for, and you can just paste it from the lab itself, but just like showing how the type ahead works. Not that you've never seen a type ahead before. So let's see, output status num errors. So I'm specifically saying look for this metric, so the number of error metric. Now, once again, I'm going to go ahead and start to filter this. Now, in this case, I'm going to add the origin filter. So I'm going to, like I did earlier, equals Kubernetes. Now, I don't, let's see, I don't specifically tell us or to use the travel logic info like we did earlier. You can select if you want, you don't have to, it doesn't really matter. We're just once again kind of playing around here. But what I do want to do here is I want to add an operator. The operator I want to add, as it says here, is I want to select the sum by pods. So what I did there, did that work right? So let's see, we add the operator. Oh, I'm sorry, here we go. So click add operator and then select the operator. And the operator we want to do is sum by, and then we're going to just type in pod. It should just be sum by pod, not that whole. There we go. So that's what it should look like. I'm going to go ahead and search again just to make sure we get stuff. By default, we get put in the preview table, and we really want to go back to the chart view. And so what I should see is now my chart. I can go to the general icon here and start to modify like I was doing earlier, but differently, but starting to modify that look and feel. So as it says with the panel name, I probably don't want to call it untitled. I want to give it, something more illustrative, like what we have in here. So fluentd output. I want my title big, whatever I want to do in here. Once again, then I can also go to the display and now start to play around a little bit with all kinds of details. How many maximum number of slices do I want? Where do I want to start the angle at? Etc. Now, as it mentions here, this view might not be helpful. It might be a pie chart. Pie charts are great, but maybe a bar chart is more appropriate here. Maybe a column chart's more appropriate here. You would pick the one that is best for you. And then finally, as it says under the count, wait, let me get back here. Sorry, so let me get back to the bar chart. Let's see. The number of errors to select count under statistic type. Count under statistic. Oh, here, sorry. And so here is where we specify count. And so this is a lot of errors. This is not as many errors, and starting to get that information. Once again, you can also go ahead. That's not what I wanted to show. What I wanted to show was the JSON. So we can go ahead and now start to get in here and specify all these different things. We can also, once again, just mess around with the legend. Do we want it to be on the right, the bottom? Just all these settings that really allow you to make it specific for you. I'm going to click add to dashboard. And now I should have this one. And I'm not going to worry about that little guy right now. All right. So what we want to do next is a time series panel. So what we're going to do now is, once again, add panel, choose time series. In this case, we're going to look at disk utilization. So over time, we want to see how much is our disk being utilized. So we're going to go in here. Once again, we're going to use our metrics. The metric we're going to look for specifically is going to be node disk utilization average irate. We're going to go ahead and once again select that origin of Kubernetes just to keep it looking at Kubernetes stuff. I'm going to click search, make sure I just get data, and I'm going to go back to my chart. And now I have a chart. As mentioned before, we can go to the cog icon. We can rename this, calling it something more useful, like the average disk utilization rate. Let's see, what else do we want to change in here? Oh, and then the under the display, the chart type. We actually want to use the line chart, so it actually should be defaulted to that. If it's not, the line chart just is more appropriate, I think, here. And so now what we're starting to see here in this line chart is very simply disk utilization rate. Here it's very high. Here it's very low. This peak, I might want to start to investigate and figure out why it spiked so high. It didn't hit a crazy number, but it did peak. And so now I get that visualization. What I'm going to do now is, well, as you already know, click Add to Dashboard, and now I have 3 panels. And so the last panel we're going to add is text. So to add a panel, choose text, and now we can just put whatever we wanted here. So I'm going to use the text that's in here. I'm not feeling very creative, so I'm going to call it about this dashboard. And I'm just going to type the word test, but I could go ahead and now start to modify this. The font sizes, you know, all these things. Text color, I don't know, like that green, which is really actually horrible. Maybe I want to go ahead and start to put it into a darker format, or well, it's not really a dark theme, but you know, I can start to go ahead and mess around with these. That's pretty horrible. I think I'll use it. And there I have it. As we said, we're encouraging you to use the brand color. Now, what you can do here, and I don't think I showed this yet, is edit these. So let's say I created this one and this color is just not good. I can go into top right here, click those 3 little dots, and I can edit this dashboard panel right here. And this is easier. The classic way was harder. And so now I could say, you know, yeah, purple's no good, but that's better. That's bad. I like it. And so now I have my my dashboard. And so now I have my dashboard with my 4 panels. So imagine I did this work. This is now valuable information. My description of what this dashboard is very verbose. And so now what do I do with this thing? Well, certainly I want to use it myself and probably refer to it. And so I can do a few different things to it. The first thing I can do is I can choose to save it. And what I was trying to, I forgot that it exists right here, is switch to a dark theme. That's just better. Although with this orange, it's even worse, but just that is a nice feature right there. But specifically what we want to show you here is the save as. So now we can choose to save this as. Save as. And then we would just give it a name. So I'm going to keep the name it has. It's, now let me put my initials at least. And so we want to give it something, you know, of course, more verbose than that, but that's fine for now. So I'm going to click Save As. And now when I do, in the left-hand side of the screen, in my personal folder, I should now have that dashboard. I should have the other one that was created earlier, but now I have the one, the official version, I guess you could say. Now from here, I can share this. I can share this a few different ways. Well, no, actually, we've changed it. It's really one way to do it. So what I want to do is I want to go to my personal folder. I want to go to that dashboard, and I want to click on the 3 dots next to that dashboard. And from here, I want to select share. And now from here, I can decide who do I want to share this with. Do I want to share this with Frank, because he's been working on this project with me? Do I want to share this with Frank and Katie? Do I want to share this with Frank, Katie, and all the administrators? Do I want to share this with everybody? I have all these options. And then when sharing this, do I want to give them view access? Do I want them to allow them to edit it? Do I want them to be able to manage it, which is more granular? And so on and so forth. So you can get quite granular. And you saw these options or operations during the fundamentals class of sharing things. Something I'd encourage you to do, but you don't have to, is notify the recipient. So maybe for this, whoever sorry, too much clicking. Hey guys, new dashboard, check it out. Yeah, something like that. Hopefully something probably a little bit more helpful, but that's still not too bad. And then you would click share and they would get it. All right, let's see, that's lab 6. Let me go back to the slides just to kind of keep me honest with them. All right, let's do a couple slides and then we'll do lab 7, which is going to be a little bumpy, but we'll make our way through it. And then we'll do lab 8 and we'll be done. All right, so there we go, a couple slides here around monitoring and troubleshooting. And so what we're going to do is start to utilize some of these tools in Sumo Logic to look at the Kubernetes cluster. There we go. So troubleshooting monitoring. So a couple questions to kind of think to yourselves. I think there should be one more in here. Yeah. Oop. So, kind of think to yourself, does every alert or warning need your immediate attention? Maybe, maybe not. Different views about how to look at that. How can you find more information about an issue? Well, we're going to start to look at that and utilize the pods and start to dig into there. And so how can we start to resolve these issues is starting to look at utilization. So starting to take things like our pods and looking at the resources that are tied to them and seeing, are there alerts because of high resource utilization? Do we see those spikes in those graphs? Do we have an alert that's actually going to notify us? And we're going to do that alert a little bit later. And so just things to keep in mind when troubleshooting and monitoring, excuse me. So as we explore and we use the cluster overview earlier, and we might jump into it earlier, we can start to ask ourselves some basic questions about the cluster's health and start to see, are there any worker nodes that are unhealthy? Are resources being used up? Have pods crashed? Why have they crashed is also going to be important. Is scaling and routing working properly? And so these are things that we can check in the dashboard and use those graphs or whatever view we select to start to dig into that. Now, some common alerts. When you check your dashboard, it's not the only way you want to monitor and maintain and troubleshoot your cluster. Checking the dashboard is good, but there's other ways to do it. And so for more pressing concerns, you might want to start to set up alerts. And so some of the issues that we're really only talk about one of these today, but some of the more common issues that I thought were just important enough to remind you of that Kubernetes clusters run into. So these are the 3 most common or most popular. Crash loops. So what happens there is sometimes your replication service will keep restarting pods in order to maintain the correct number of replicas, as they're called. But when this happens, the affected pods can often have a crash loop back off status. So a status of crash loop back off. And I think we'll show an example of that in the labs. And so what you might want to do is create an alert that occurs anytime a pod has a status, or if one pod maintains the status for a period of time. So that might be an alert that would be helpful. Another alert that might be helpful are nodes not ready. So if there are insufficient resources allocated to a node, it might have the status of not ready or unknown. And so you might want to create an alert to let you know if a certain percentage of your nodes have this status. Memory limits exceeded. When a container requests more memory than it's allocated, Kubernetes may be destroyed and restart the container. And if the container still needs more memory, this process may repeat. And so you might want to create an alert if containers are being frequently destroyed and restarted. Just common suggestions. Now, what do you want to do once you receive these alerts? What should you do? So if you get a crash loop alert, for example, you might want to check your service and deployment settings to make sure you have the correct number of pods for the jobs you want your cluster to perform. For the nodes not ready, how might you resolve that? You might want to allocate more resources to your nodes to keep them up and running. And for the memory limit exceeded, very simply, allocate more memory to your containers. And finally, don't forget to ask for help if you get in trouble. The Sumo Logic support team is here for you. If you can't figure out the Kubernetes problems on your own, someone on our team can probably help you. And we can get you that help faster if you do a little work first. So what we want you to do, if you want to submit a support ticket around Kubernetes, which please do, we want these details, or as much of the details you can get. So certainly your company info, which you should know, of course, but the cluster info, so that we can start to look or help you look at what's going on. And of course, a description of the problem. Kind of obvious, but these are things we want, and the more information you provide us, the more problem resolution we can help you with. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get back into the labs. And so, come on, lab guide. Got my lab guide. Got my Sumo. Going to do a new. Well, actually, I'm just going to go straight to home because I'll just go home. And what we're going to do is now we're going to do lab 7. Now, the first step, well, I'll show you. We're going to do lab 7 in kind of 2 parts, but let's do it. So what we want to do is we want to troubleshoot a pod. Now, we're not going to be able to fully get through this lab, but we are going to show you what occurs in this lab, so you'll get the whole picture. But as it says, imagine you received an alert about pods being down. So you're working at Travelogic and you get an alert that your pods are down. Well, what do you do? How should you investigate this issue? Well, here's a good way to do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to New and Explore. By default, actually, by default, I should be in whatever node view, whatever view I selected previously, but I want you to select the namespace view. Once you select the namespace view, I want you to specifically select prod 01 Travelogic info. And then once you have that, then I want us to go down to prod loggen. So we're going into the namespace view, we're going into the cluster for Travelogic, and we're going to the namespace of prod loggen. Once this runs, what we should start to see are, there we go. So what I did is I select the Kubernetes namespace overview. And what I should now see here are my pods that are running, my pods that have failed, and how many total pods, which are just those 2 numbers added up. But what I see here are 2 pods that failed. Now, what 2 pods have failed? Well, here I see Carbon Black and CrowdStrike. My MongoDB is going fine. My Google Apps working great. But Carbon Black and CrowdStrike are having issues. I can click on these pods. I can click on any of the pods, but I can click on these specifically. And now what I start to see is information about what's occurring or not occurring, as the case may be. So what we're seeing here, I mean, it says what you're seeing here, so I'm going to give you a moment just to think about it real fast. So what are we seeing here? What we're seeing here is a graph that's showing us going from 0 to 1 and back to 0. And what 0 and 1 are essentially representing here, if you think of binary, is on and off. 0 is off, 1 is on. So what's happening here is it's off and it tries to turn on and then it shuts down. It's trying to turn itself on and it shuts down. And so it can't hold, as it says in the lab, that ready state of 1. It's not able to stay on. Conversely, let me see if I look at one that's good, I got ones all across. It's on, on, on. But these two are turning on and shutting down. And that's good to know. That's quite important to know. Now, I don't know why they're shutting down and not turning on properly, but I do know that. But now we're going to start to investigate that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the carbon black one. It doesn't really matter too much. And I'm going to select this entities tab. What this entities tab is going to allow us to do is get more information about, in this case, the carbon black container. Here we're seeing CPU usage, memory usage. But it's also going to allow us to drill down into those other areas. So what we can do is say, let's look specifically at the pod level. Now, once I have this pod level open, what I want to do is open in the pod, open in entity dashboard. And what this is going to show is just more specific information or detailed information about this specific pod. What we should see in here is, more, as it says, more detailed information about the pod. And we should see a crashed loopback error message. Let's see, do we see it? We see carbon black, we see the info. I see, yeah, here it is. So here is the crash loopback 1. So here's that indication of that error. But as we see, there's no indication of spikes in memory usage. CPU limitation or CPU usage is pretty normal. So what we want to now do is start to investigate and look in the logs and try to figure out what has occurred. So we see what's occurring as far as the metrics of it's not turning on or it's not staying on. Now we want to figure out why. So what we can do is we could go into the logs now. So what I'm doing here in the very bottom is I have my logs and I can choose open and search. And now I'm brought into the log interface. And now I'm starting to look at my carbon black logs specific for this pod, specific for this time period. And so I see information in here. Now, let's see what I want to show, or as it says, for the rest of the lab, what we're going to do is we're going to use the screenshots. Maybe we're going to use the screenshots of the lab, but actually I can show you a different way to do this. What I want to, in fact, let's see, let's do, okay. This is what I want to do. It's going to be a little bumpy, but it's going to work. What I see is this access ID. So I see a bunch of information, rather, excuse me. I see 4 pages of information. But what I want to be drawn to, and I'm kind of leading you here, is this access ID. Because this access ID is going to tell me who or what, because it doesn't have to be a person, is utilizing this service. These are credentials, essentially. This is someone's username. What I want to do is I want to look for this username in the system. Now, what I don't want to do is use this username. What I want to use is a different username. I want to use the username that's in the lab itself. This is going to be in step 12. So what you should see is final, let's see, can you copy it? Let's see, how are we going to do this? Actually, it's not going to work. Sorry. Let me do, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the screenshots here. Yeah, the lab it's not doing what I want to. So let me show you in the screenshots what would happen here. So what we have is we looked at our logs for carbon black, and what we were hoping to find was an error code. And the error code here that we were hoping to find is this error message. And you're not going to see it, but we're using the lab for this. And was specifically an error related status code of 401. What the 401 tells us is that there's an issue with authentication. So that means something is not starting quite right for our Carbon Black, something related to authentication. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to look for the access ID in the log messages, because we want to see whose authentication is possibly failing, or what's going on with this authentication. So what we find is this ID. What we can then do is take that ID that's found in these Carbon Black logs and actually go to a new log search and say, show me this ID. So look for all this ID through all the logs, not just Kubernetes logs, not just Travel Logic logs. Look for this ID, this string of text, anywhere in the system. And what it's going to find is this sequence right here. What appears to be happening, and what we're showing here, is this user of Shady plus sock, so Shady, our sock user, is deleting this access key and disabling this key. So that's what's causing the authentication, is our key is being deleted or disabled. Now what we can do is we can utilize the key and utilize the log messages and start to get a better story of what was occurring. And when we do the surrounding messages feature for our log messages, and I think you saw this in probably Search Mastery, if you joined that class, we would get these 5 messages. And so what are these 5 messages showing us? What we're seeing is Kenneth logs out, our SOC person logs in, our SOC person deletes our user called Kenneth, and by deleting the user, that's disabling his access keys and deleting his access keys. So essentially what has happened here is our Shady SOC has deleted Kenneth's credentials. And since the pod had no way to authenticate, it tried to turn on, it couldn't authenticate, it turned off. Tried a few minutes, turned on, turned off. And so what has happened, or our epilogue, as we say here, is Kenneth left Travel Logic. He was offboarded by the SOC, and the SOC person should not have deleted or disabled his account prior to talking to Kenneth's manager, because Kenneth's manager should have known that Kenneth's keys are still active. And so essentially not deleting those keys would have kept everything up and running. So I apologize, it's got a little bumpy in here. We were having an issue with the data showing up. So I hope to get that resolved in the future. But hopefully the story still was helpful in that we can and did look at, was able to look at, look at our dashboards, utilize our dashboards to get into our logs. If our logs were working correctly, we would then be able to use our log search to look for that ID or that thing that kind of stood out to us, and then seeing where that ID is associated in other logs. Then using the surrounding message features to say, look at this specific event and those events that happened around it during a similar time period, and then just deducing or doing our detective work to figure out what actually occurred. All right. Last lab, which is a good one, both because it's last and it's a good one, is creating an alert. So as mentioned a few times and intentionally sort of repetitive, there's value in the alerts and actually keeping you out of Sumo Logic. And so what we want to show you is how to create an alert. The alert we want to set up is one around pod failure. So what we want to do is check, or have the system check, if there have been more than 10 pods down in 1 hour, or excuse me, if more than 10 pods have been down for over an hour. And the language there is important. So how do we do this? Lab guide. Oh, come on, lab guide. And so what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the black nav bar again. So you might have that hidden. If you do, unhide it, and go down to manage data and go to monitoring. And this is where you can both see existing monitors. So you see a bunch that have been set up by many people, some real ones, some test ones. And now we're going to create one. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a monitor. And now we're going to start to define the trigger. So what is this going to monitor? When is it going to trigger and alert us? Well, that's what we're going to define right now. And we're going to do so using a query. So we want to, once again, specify metrics because we want to look at our metrics related to Kubernetes. Specifically, we can go ahead and grab that query that exists in the kind of the middle portion of the screen. We could also, let me see this, just want to make sure this works. We can also go, or should also go to advanced mode. So in the query metrics, click on the 3 dots and go to advanced mode. And then you can just paste that whole line in step 5 in. I'm going to run it just to make sure that I actually get data. It's chugging along. And as it says, if the query is valid, a graph should appear. So it looks like, yeah, it's valid. Okay, cool. So I got my graph. Now what we want to do is turn this into an alert. So, or continue turning this into an alert, excuse me. We've now set up the monitor. It now knows what to run, but now we want to set up the trigger. So when do we want to be triggered? Do we want to be triggered when there's missing data? Yeah. If there's no data in a 5-minute period, I probably want to know that because I should be getting data all the time. This thing's up and running, or it's up, it's up and running. It's at least producing data all the time. Whether it's up and running or not, it's still producing data. And so I want to make sure if there's no data in 5 minutes, let me know. But more importantly, I want to focus on the warning here. So I can go ahead and say, alert me when result is greater than, come on, check, there we go. There we go, sorry, I don't know why my computer's being so slow. There we go. So here's my historical trend. And what I can say is alert me when we have more than 1,200 in 5 minutes. And I can set that as a warning. What I can do is I can say critical is if we go to 1,600. So at 1,200, that's a warning, that's concerning. You know, somebody probably needs to know about it. But if we hit 1,600 in 5 minutes, that's, you know, panic essentially. So now I have my 3 different triggers. I have my missing data. If there's no data, I'm going to get notified. If I'm hitting 1,200 in 5 minutes, I'm going to get notified. And if I'm hitting 1,600 within 5 minutes, I'm going to be notified. Now we're going to talk about that notification in this next step right here of how am I going to be notified? What I can do is I can scroll to the bottom-ish, step 3, and I can choose my connection type. Create a new email is probably the most common. Send an email to somebody. But we can go ahead and we can get more granular, not more granular, we can use Slack, we can use webhooks, we can use other communication properties. What I can also do here is I can start to modify who is going to get notified. So for example, let's keep it really simple. So for a for a warning alert, I'm going to get notified. But you know what? For critical, I'm going to get notified as well. I certainly need to know it. But you know what? My manager needs to know about those criticals. She needs to be on top of it as well because her manager will ask her. And so I can now start to be dynamic. Also missing data, maybe I just want that. And so I can specify. Let's see, what else? Oh, and then naming the monitor. So just giving this thing like it says a name. So I'm going to call it K8 as class alert. My initials. The default location is fine. All the other stuff is fine. And then I'm going to click save. When I do, I should now see in this list, I should see my alert. I should see my status and, more information. So here's the alert. Excuse me, here's the alert type, the query, the detection method, those values of when I'm going to be notified, the triggers I created, or the notifications based on those triggers. And then what I can also see in here, although, is the monitor history, which is kind of cool. So it can start to show me when I did have issues and when I didn't. So, all right. I think that just about wraps it up. Let me make sure, just keep me honest here with the slides. Yep. So any questions? All right, so let me start to direct you to the exam. If there are questions, of course, as well, please ask, but let's get you into that next step. So what we want to do now is we want to take you into the certification portal. It's important that you do this not as the training user you logged in as, because we don't want training user 1, 2, 3 getting credit for the exam. We want you, to get a credit. So make sure you log into Sumo using your personal or private or professional credentials, really. This exam is going to have 20 plus questions. You'll have 60 minutes to take it. You need a 70 to pass, very similar to our other exams, and similar to our other exams in the fact that it's open resource. So you have access to documentation, the lab guide, the slides. Let me see if I can give you the slides. I'll work on that in just a second. I think I can at least put them in the chat. Yeah, so let me show you how to get in there. So what you're going to want to do is make sure, remember, that you log out of Sumo. And then that you log in using your personal or professional credentials. And remember them correctly. So you'll be logged in here. You'll go to the home page and go to certification. You'll go to get certified. You will go to get certified. Once under get certified, you're going to want to select the class. So today's class is Kubernetes on Sumo Logic. It's the only Kubernetes one. Go ahead and click on it. Go ahead and register for free. As a reminder, with our exams, they're free for you, free for everybody. And then you're going to go ahead and click start. It's going to give you those guidelines of, like I said, 30 questions, 60 minutes. Really just what I said, pass rate 70. And then you'll click next. And then you will take the exam. So you'll click start assessment. And you'll go through and you'll answer the questions. Once you're done, you'll click submit all answers. You'll get a better score than I did. And it's important at this point that you click close course. If you don't click close course, you won't get credit for the exam. Even if you passed and got 100, you need to click close course. So just really important that you do that. And that's about it. So let me go ahead and put the link to the Uber Eats, because I know that's important to many of you, rightfully so. So the Uber Eats, let me try and get those slides in there. Let me just stick them in there. Just waiting one more second for it to download. There we go. All right, so the slides are in the chat too. It's taking a while to load. Well, they'll load eventually. Unfortunately, they're 40 megs, which I guess isn't that bad, but so the slides should be in that chat now. So go ahead and start the exam. Once you're done, of course, leave. You don't need to hang around. But thank you for coming. I hope this was helpful. I hope it got you uh, knowledge that you didn't have before. As mentioned, support is here for you. So if there's questions, more specifically technical questions, please contact support. They'll help you with whatever you need. But thank you for attending, and best of luck. I'm going to put myself on mute. I and Odell will be hanging out for a little bit. So if there's questions, go ahead. If you need to take the exam later, that's fine. I see some of you have to head out, and I don't blame you. Chris, if you have a question about the voucher, if you want to just put it in the chat, that's fine. I'll help answer it. But otherwise, I'll really just kind of shut up and let everybody keep going. So thank you again. Like I said, I'll be on mute. Questions, put them in the chat. And yeah, best of luck.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and end our session here. Hopefully you guys had a good session. We thank you for joining us. We look forward to you joining us in an upcoming training. Again, have a good rest of your day.